The Carlisle mansion, nestled in a picturesque valley, seemed alive on this sunny day. Its stately columns stood in perfect order, and the massive windows reflected the cloudless sky, evoking a scene straight out of a movie about a flawless life. But today, it wasn't just beautiful, it was elegant. The lawn in front of the house was awash in white roses, their scent blending with the soft breeze, weaving itself into every detail of the celebration. Dozens of guests gathered on the lawn, men in sharp suits, women in sophisticated dresses, and children dressed as miniature replicas of adult grandeur. Henry Carlisle, the head of the family and one of the most influential businessmen in the country, stood at the entrance, greeting each guest with a perfectly practiced smile. But behind that smile lay tension. His heart beat just a little faster than usual, and his eyes kept drifting back to a tall, graceful figure in a white gown moving among the guests, his daughter, Emma. She was radiant in her wedding dress, a vision of silk and lace that resembled a floating cloud. Today, she was starting a new chapter, marrying the man she loved with all her heart. Henry watched her, his mind replaying how quickly the years had passed. Not long ago, she was running barefoot across this very lawn, and now he was giving her away. For him, it was a moment of both joy and heartbreak. Emma wasn't just his daughter, she was his only family, his solace, his reason for living after the losses he had endured. Preparations for the ceremony were in full swing on the terrace. Golden champagne cascaded into tall crystal flutes, waitstaff with impeccable smiles carried trays of appetizers, and an orchestra played a soft, enchanting melody. Guests mingled between tables, chatting and laughing, occasionally glancing at their watches. Everyone was waiting for the main event, but one detail threatened to upset the perfect day. The MC responsible for leading the ceremony was nowhere to be found. Henry frowned as he checked his watch. His assistant had assured him the woman was reliable and came highly recommended, but her tardiness was throwing off the meticulously planned schedule. Henry stepped aside, masking his irritation. He was used to being in control of everything, but today he felt an unfamiliar sense of helplessness. It was as if something intangible hung in the air, beyond his grasp. And then she appeared. At first, her figure emerged on the horizon, a tall woman in a striking red dress with a flowing train. She walked with confidence, her platinum blonde hair catching the sunlight, and her eyes, lined in bold black, seemed hypnotic even from a distance. Henry noticed the guests stirring, whispering among themselves, while Emma paused, gazing at the woman with a flicker of surprise. "Apologies for the delay," she said as she approached the stage. Her voice was deep, carrying a blend of sincerity and mystery. Introducing herself as Lauren Brooks, she smiled warmly and dove into her role. Lauren quickly captivated the guests with her charisma. Her light humor and heartfelt words melted away the tension that had built during the wait. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Glasses clinked in toasts, and applause followed her opening remarks. It seemed as if she had total command over the atmosphere. But when Lauren picked up the microphone and announced, "This song is dedicated to the beautiful bride and her father," everything shifted. Henry, who had been standing off to the side observing the ceremony, felt his heart skip a beat. The first note of the song struck him like a lightning bolt. It was a melody he hadn't heard in decades. Yet it lived in his memory as vividly as the present moment. His eyes shot toward the stage. Lauren was singing. Her voice was powerful and moving, reaching into the depths of his soul. But it wasn't her voice that stunned him the most. It was her eyes. He couldn't look away. Those eyes were familiar. They reminded him of someone he had once known but lost forever. He took an unsteady step closer to the stage, oblivious to the world around him. Memories flooded his mind. Images, scents, voices from a past he had buried deep. His breath quickened, and his heart pounded so loudly it seemed everyone could hear it. This can't be," he whispered, barely able to contain the tears that threatened to spill. Lauren noticed his movement and met his gaze. For a fleeting moment, something like recognition flickered in her expression, but she didn't stop singing. Her voice continued to mesmerize the crowd, but for Henry, this moment was a catalyst. As the past and present collided, Henry realized something extraordinary was unfolding, something that could change everything. Years ago, young Henry Carlyle was far from the confident and successful man he appeared to be on his daughter's wedding day. Back then, he was just a boy from a small provincial town, a place where dreams often stayed just that, dreams. But Henry always believed his life was meant for something greater. Gathering his modest savings, he packed his clothes into a battered suitcase and set off for the big city, chasing a chance to change his destiny. The city greeted him with chaos, bustling crowds, endless streets, and a noise that never seemed to fade. It was a world where everyone always seemed to have some place to be. Henry's first job was on a construction site. They assigned him the hardest physical tasks, but he never complained. He was grateful to earn an honest wage and dreamed of saving enough to start his own business, or maybe even build a home one day. On the site, Henry quickly earned the respect of his coworkers through his relentless work ethic. He stayed late, helped others with their tasks, and never lost his smile despite the grueling days. But his dreams of a brighter future came crashing down in an instant. A new foreman arrived, a hard-faced man with a sharp, unforgiving gaze, and it became clear from day one that he cared only about profits, not people. Within a month, Henry and several other workers were fired without pay. The company withheld their documents, citing unpaid debts, leaving them with no way to defend themselves. Suddenly, Henry found himself on the streets, with no money, no papers, and no options. For days he wandered the city, desperately searching for work, but no one would hire him without proper identification. His last coins were spent on a loaf of bread, and his nights were spent curled up on park benches. The lively sparkle in his eyes dulled, and his shoulders, once used to carrying heavy loads, sagged under the weight of despair. One particularly cold evening, Henry sat on a bench in the park, his head bowed. His thoughts were bleak. He recalled his hometown, his mother's warnings that the city would swallow him whole, and the dreams that now seemed foolish and unattainable. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and twilight was beginning to envelop the park. "Are you all right, young man?" a voice suddenly asked. Henry looked up to see an elderly woman with a kind face and wise, knowing eyes. She was dressed neatly in a coat and held a small basket of groceries in her arms. "Not really," Henry admitted, barely holding back tears. The woman sat down beside him, resting the basket on her lap. She introduced herself as Mrs. Grayson, a housekeeper for one of the wealthy families in the city. Their conversation began with a few simple questions, but soon Henry found himself sharing his entire story. He wasn't complaining, just explaining, recounting everything from his hopeful arrival in the city to his current dire circumstances. Mrs. Grayson listened intently, never interrupting. Her eyes were filled with empathy, but she didn't offer empty platitudes. When Henry finished, she said, "You strike me as a kind and hard-working man. I know how hard it is to face such hardships. There's a position available at the house I work for, a groundskeeper. It's not a glamorous job, but it's honest work. And if you're willing, I'll personally vouch for you with the owners." Henry could barely hold back tears of gratitude. He couldn't believe someone was willing to help him. He immediately agreed. The next day, Mrs. Grayson brought him to a grand mansion surrounded by a meticulously kept garden. The house looked like a palace, and Henry feared he wouldn't be accepted. But thanks to Mrs. Grayson's recommendation, he was given the job. The work was tough, but Henry poured all his energy into it. He cleaned the grounds, maintained the gardens, and even assisted other staff members when they were overwhelmed. His dedication and humility didn't go unnoticed. The owners praised his efforts and even offered him a small raise, impressed by how much he contributed beyond his duties. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt his life regaining purpose. He was deeply grateful to Mrs. Grayson for her kindness and for giving him a second chance. His respect for her knew no bounds. But Henry's journey was far from over. Ahead of him lay an encounter that would change his life forever, reigniting his belief that even in the darkest moments, fate has a way of offering us a path to happiness. The Carlyle mansion was fully prepared for the celebration. The golden glow of the massive chandelier scattered sparks across the walls of the spacious hall, while long tables were already laden with exquisite dishes. Henry, as usual, kept to the sidelines, watching the preparations from a distance. That evening, the household was celebrating the birthday of the master of the house, and all the staff were working tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect. Henry carried out his tasks quietly, trying not to draw attention to himself, though he couldn't shake a strange feeling, like tonight would change his life forever. Guests began to arrive, and among them was Margaret, the lady of the house's cousin. Her refined features, graceful walk, and simple yet elegant turquoise dress immediately set her apart from the others. But Henry truly noticed her when she approached the grand piano. The musicians paused briefly, and the hostess announced that Margaret would be performing a few songs in honor of her uncle. When Margaret began to sing, everything around seemed to stop. Her voice was rich and warm, flowing like a river that carried its listeners far beyond the mansion's walls. Every note, every word struck straight to the heart. Henry stood by a column, utterly captivated. At that moment, he felt something he couldn't quite put into words. Her voice wasn't just music, it was pure magic. When the performance ended, the room erupted in applause. Margaret, bowing slightly, smiled, but then her gaze fell on Henry. She noticed his still figure by the column, and a flicker of curiosity flashed in her eyes. Soon after, the orchestra announced a white dance, a rare moment when the ladies could invite gentlemen to the floor. Henry didn't think anyone would pay him any attention. He stood, trying to blend into the shadow of the column, but suddenly felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find Margaret. "I've noticed you watching me all evening," she said with a smile. "May I have this dance?" Henry froze, unable to believe his ears. His heart pounded so loudly it felt as if everyone could hear it. But Margaret patiently waited, her hand extended. He couldn't refuse. With trembling fingers he took her hand, and they stepped onto the floor. The music began again, and Henry felt as if he'd entered another world. He didn't know where to look, into her eyes or at their interlaced hands. Margaret, however, seemed completely at ease, as though she were dancing not with a servant but with a prince. The dance was brief, but for Henry it felt like an eternity. After the dance, Margaret didn't leave. She stayed by his side, striking up a casual conversation. Henry shared a little about himself, careful not to reveal too much, not wanting to seem too simple. But Margaret listened intently, genuinely interested. It was as if she saw not just a servant, but a man with potential for so much more. In the days that followed, they began meeting regularly. Margaret would come to the garden where Henry worked, and they would talk for hours. He was amazed by her kindness, her sense of humor, and her depth of character. She, in turn, admired his honesty and humility. Their relationship blossomed quickly. For the first time in his life, Henry felt like he had found his place. However, their fairy tale wasn't without a villain. Margaret's sister Sarah was vehemently opposed to their relationship. She believed Margaret deserved someone of her own social standing, not a servant. Sarah repeatedly tried to convince Margaret to end things with Henry, but Margaret only laughed. "He's honest and kind," she said. "Isn't that what real wealth is all about?" But Sarah wasn't one to give up. She knew that simple persuasion wouldn't work, so she decided to take a more cunning approach. One day, she invited Henry for a chat, supposedly to clear up any misunderstandings. Her tone was soft, but her words cut like a knife. "You do realize this is just a passing fancy for Margaret, don't you?" she began. "Do you really think you can give her the life she deserves? Or do you want her to live in poverty, supporting you?" Henry said nothing. He didn't know how to fight against such cold logic. But doubts began to creep into his mind. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he really was holding Margaret back. Through it all, Margaret remained steadfast in her feelings. She stayed by Henry's side, offering encouragement and reassurance. But Sarah continued to insist that their relationship was a mistake. And one day she found a way to shatter their happiness. That evening, which had begun with magic, ended with unease. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that their fairy tale might come to an abrupt end, though he had no idea just how cruel the blow would be. Weeks passed since Margaret and Henry began building their happiness, ignoring the sideways glances and hushed disapproval of Margaret's sister. Their meetings were filled with laughter, dreams, and sincere promises. Henry eagerly awaited every moment he could see her smile again. To him, she was everything, his inspiration, his future. But one day, everything changed. Margaret left with the homeowners for the city to assist with family matters. The next morning, Margaret's sister approached Henry with a grave expression. "There's been an accident," she said coldly. "My sister and the master of the house are in critical condition. They've been taken to the city hospital." Henry, barely processing her words, felt his vision blur. "I need to be there. I'll go to her," he declared, grabbing his coat. But Margaret's sister blocked his path. "No," she said firmly. "The doctors are fighting for their lives right now. Your panic won't help anyone. Stay here and wait for updates." Henry wanted to argue, but her cold, unyielding tone stopped him. He spent the entire day clutching his hat and praying for Margaret's survival. Each passing minute was an agonizing eternity. The next morning, the lady of the house came to him herself. Her face was stern, but her eyes betrayed an underlying weariness. Henry leapt to his feet, hoping for good news, but her words pierced him like a dagger. "Margaret has passed away. The doctors couldn't save her." His world collapsed. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's impossible. She can't be gone. We were supposed to be together." His voice trembled, but the lady of the house was merciless. "Your relationship with her was a mistake. You were never her equal. You're a servant, Henry, and she was part of this family. All you brought her was pain." Her words cut deeper than any news. Henry tried to respond, but she turned and walked away, leaving him in utter despair. Within hours, he was handed his final paycheck and told to leave. He was no longer needed. With a heavy heart, carrying the unbearable weight of loss, Henry left the place where he had once dared to dream of a better life. Returning to his hometown, he found himself consumed by depression. Days blurred into a monotonous existence filled with bitterness and pain. He rarely left the house, losing interest in life's joys. His parents, understanding his struggle, refused to let him sink entirely. With their support, Henry slowly began to rebuild his life. He found work and tried to bury the memories of his past. Time, though slow, began to heal his wounds. Years later, a woman entered his life, bringing with her a glimmer of light. Her name was Catherine. She was a few years older than Henry, wise and kind-hearted. Catherine saw something in Henry that no one else had, his sincerity and the depth of his soul. Their bond wasn't the fiery love he had once felt for Margaret, but Catherine became a steadfast friend and partner. Together, they started a small business that soon began to flourish. Life, finally, felt stable again. But fate had yet another cruel twist in store. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, their joy was immeasurable. Henry could hardly believe his luck. But that moment of bliss was short-lived. Catherine passed away during childbirth, leaving Henry alone with their newborn daughter. The blow was devastating, but now he had Emma, his tiny beacon of hope. For her sake, he resolved to keep going. Years passed. Henry poured his heart into raising Emma. He was her father, her mother, her mentor, and her protector. His business thrived, and Emma grew into his greatest pride. Yet the scars of his past never fully healed. Every time he looked at Emma, he thought of Catherine, and every evening, sitting alone in the quiet of his home, he remembered Margaret and the dreams they had once shared. Now Emma was grown. Today was her wedding day, and Henry was doing everything in his power to make it perfect. Yet, he had no idea that the past was about to knock on his door, turning everything he thought he knew about his life upside down. The sounds of the melody coming from the microphone tore through the air with its tenderness and depth. Henry stood there as if rooted to the spot. The music seemed to revive memories long buried in the darkest corners of his soul. It felt like time had stopped, and his mind, against all logic, resisted what was happening. The woman on stage, dressed in an elegant red dress, sang with such intensity that her voice, like a stream, flowed straight into his heart. Henry felt his chest tighten with pain. The melody was all too familiar. It was part of his past, the part he had tried to bury. The words of the song sank into his consciousness. He watched Lauren, the woman who so confidently commanded the stage. Her movements, her tone, her eyes. Those eyes? Henry slowly realized that his heart wasn't deceiving him. At first, he took a small step forward, then another. His legs seemed to move on their own. The noise of the guests, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all faded away. It was just him and this woman. His face revealed his emotions: confusion, pain, hope. Lauren met his gaze. She noticed how his expression had changed, how his hands were trembling. She kept singing, but her voice became softer, a bit shaky. When the melody ended, she slowly lowered the microphone. She took a step to the edge of the stage. Henry moved closer, his eyes filled with tears. "It's you." His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. She stepped down a small staircase from the stage, walking toward him. Face to face, only an arm's length apart, they froze. Lauren smiled, but in that smile was so much pain that Henry had never seen before. "I saw how you were looking at me. May I have this dance?" Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried the same tone he had remembered all these years. "Margaret?" Henry's words sounded like a prayer, like a cry of the soul. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Henry, I know this is unbelievable," she began, her voice trembling. "But I have to explain everything to you." They moved away from the curious eyes of the guests, who had already turned their attention to lively conversations and the next round of toasts. "After the accident, I didn't die," Lauren, or Margaret, continued. "But my face, it was completely disfigured. I lost consciousness and woke up in the hospital. The doctor said it would take years to recover, if it was even possible." Henry listened, holding his breath. Her voice, the one he hadn't heard in so many years, was just like it used to be. "When I asked about you," she lowered her eyes. "My sister? She told me that you left me as soon as you found out I wouldn't be the same. She lied, Henry. She lied to keep us apart." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I left. I gathered my last strength and moved abroad. That's where my new life began. I underwent dozens of surgeries to restore even part of my face. Those were the hardest years of my life. Why didn't you look for me?" Henry's voice was hollow, filled with a mix of resentment and despair. "Because I believed her," she replied. "I believed you really didn't want to see me. But Henry, I never stopped loving you." Her confession seemed to break a hole in his heart. Henry felt how the years of bitterness and loss faded away, making room for something else, something bright and painfully familiar. A gentle evening breeze swept across the spacious terrace of the mansion, where the festive evening continued under the open sky. Guests, who had been eagerly discussing the ceremony that had just taken place, suddenly quieted, their attention drawn to the scene on the makeshift stage. All eyes were on Henry Carlyle and Lauren. The music coming from the speakers was so powerful it seemed to be guiding their movements. Henry, holding Lauren's hand tightly, felt every note of the song stirring memories inside him. He gazed into her eyes, those very eyes that had once become his entire world. Lauren, with a slight smile, seemed to be trying to say more than words could express. Their slow dance was both tender and ceremonial, as if it wasn't just a dance but a symbol of their shared fate, full of loss and rediscovery. Emma, standing a little to the side, watched in awe and reverence. Her father, whom she had always known to be strong and composed, was showing a side of himself she had never seen before, vulnerable and alive. This was a man she didn't know, and yet, in a way, it was also the father she had always loved. She understood. This moment was significant not just for him but for her as well. The music faded, but Henry and Lauren continued to twirl. Their movements slowed, becoming almost imperceptible, until they completely stopped, lost in the silence. The sense of time and space disappeared for them. "I thought I lost you forever," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "You never lost me," Lauren replied. "I always thought of you, even when it felt like the pain was too much to bear." She looked away, but Henry gently took her chin, guiding her gaze back to him. "All these years, I thought I didn't deserve happiness," he said. "But now I understand. I was waiting for you." They stood there, oblivious to the guests who had begun to whisper among themselves. Lauren wanted to say something, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I fought to survive. I thought you had abandoned me, that you didn't care. But it was all a lie. Your love, it was always with me." Henry held her close, and the world around them ceased to exist. This was everything he had waited for decades. Meanwhile, the guests began to disperse around the terrace, unsure of how to react to this unexpected drama. Some tried to continue enjoying themselves, while others couldn't take their eyes off the couple on the stage. As the music played again, Emma walked over to Henry and Lauren. "Dad," she said softly, touching his arm. "Can you introduce us?" Henry glanced at his daughter and then at Lauren. This is, he hesitated, searching for the right words. This is Margaret, Lauren. Lauren smiled, correcting him. My name is Lauren now. Emma, sensing the significance of this moment for her father, smiled quietly. Well, Lauren, I'm glad you two found each other. Her words seemed to break the tension. Henry sighed with relief and hugged Lauren again. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Lauren and Henry sat together on a bench in the garden. The soft light of the lanterns illuminated their faces. Did you know fate would bring us together again? Lauren asked quietly. No, Henry replied. But I always felt like my life wasn't complete. Lauren rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, savoring the moment. The night was coming to an end. The next day, life would return to its usual rhythm, but for Henry and Lauren, that rhythm would now be something entirely new. Their second chance was a gift they weren't going to let slip away. For Emma, this wedding wasn't just the beginning of her new life. It was a reminder that love is stronger than time and circumstances. When the last of the guests had left the mansion, Henry stood by the window, watching the sunrise. Lauren quietly approached him and placed her hand on his shoulder. We have everything we need to be happy now, she said. Henry turned to her, looking into her eyes, and answered, Yes, and I'll never let us lose each other again. With the first rays of the sun, a new chapter of their life began, one filled with love, forgiveness, and a promise to never lose each other again. How did you find out about the wedding? He asked, still not believing this was happening for real. A few months ago, I decided to hire a private investigator. They found you, told me about your life. When I learned you were marrying off your daughter, I knew that was my only chance. I arranged to be the host at her wedding, just so I could see you again. Henry looked at her. His hands trembled as he touched her cheek, as though afraid she might disappear. All this time, his voice broke. You were alive. And all this time I loved you, Henry, she said, cupping his face in her hands. Loved you, no matter what. They froze in that moment, as if the world had stopped. The loud music and the sounds of the guests disappeared for them. All that mattered was that they had found each other again. I won't let anyone tear us apart again, Henry finally said, holding her close. Margaret pressed against him, feeling her heart fill with warmth she hadn't known in years. In the background, another song began to play. Guests stood up to dance again, and Henry, taking Margaret's hand, did the one thing he could in that moment. May I have this dance? His voice was soft but confident. She smiled through her tears and answered, with pleasure.